Greetings, Fire Chargers, Darkblade here, and in this video we will be reacting to a video titled The Impossible Challenge of Human Names by J.J. McCullough. 3, 2, 1, go.
Hello friends, my name is JJ. So the other day I was reading an article in the CBC written by this person. The author is described as being a native Canadian woman from Quebec, with her particular nation having another rather difficult to pronounce name. The reason these names are hard for me to pronounce is because they are obviously from a language I don't know, in this case the indigenous North American language that English speakers have traditionally called Mohawk. For much of its history, this language was only communicated orally, but in 1993,
I think that's the case with lots of languages in areas that were historically, let's just say, late to come across literacy. They do have a lot of their own achievements, notable achievements, however. In fact, I'm not really sure which ones were late to literacy and which ones weren't. Which ones adopted literacy and which ones just created it on their own. I don't know.
Mohawk Language Standardization Project established certain protocols for its written form, with perhaps the most notable being that it would use the Western alphabet rather than some new one, as say the Inuit had done. But despite this, the Mohawk also adopted a pronunciation system that was completely their own, using punctuation marks like colons and apostrophes to signal the stressing of certain sounds. So for example, I looked it up, and the reporter's name is pronounced Gunasio. If that was no good, I also have a clip of her saying her name herself.
Gunasio dear here.
The Mohawk name for their nation, meanwhile, is pronounced Gunyengehaga. Anyway, the whole thing got me thinking about how one of the great unresolved issues in human language is how to handle names from another language when communicating in your own. Can you translate a name?
Well, I think there are several different ways to approach translating a name, and several different ways to actually do the translating itself. For example, take the Greek name Petros, which literally means rock. There are two ways to translate it. One is with the literal meaning of the word, and the other is how it's traditionally been rendered.
Should you even try? And if not, are names just destined to be one of the biggest stumbling blocks of cross-cultural communication forever? It really doesn't seem like any human civilization has come up with a consistent set of rules or principles or protocols for dealing with names from a foreign language, which just makes it all the more fascinating and frustrating to observe all of the ways in which we've tried. So at one time, Western cultures did believe that proper names could be translated just like any other type of noun. Just as you could translate the English word apple into the French word pomme, so too could you translate the English name Francis into the French name Francois. A famous example of this would be the guy we call Christopher Columbus, who to this day is known by different names in different languages, including Cristoforo Colombo in Italian, Cristobal Colon in Spanish, or Cristofal Colombo in Portuguese. You see this a lot when you study historical kings as well. A lot of famous kings or emperors that we call Charles or Philip or Joseph might actually be known as Carlos or Philippe or Joseph in their own countries. The real name of the famous...
Yeah, and Wikipedia also anglicizes a lot of monarchs' names, but also there are also a lot that it doesn't anglicize. I think the demarcation depends on how close they are to history or to the present, or whether they're still alive or not, but I don't know this.
Russian Tsar Peter the Great, for instance, was Pyotr the Great, while the doomed Nicholas II was actually Nikolai. I remember as late as the 1990s, you would still sometimes see the late Belgian king Boudoir called Baldwin in some English sources.
That's easier to say.
And this is still generally the translation that is used when you're referring to the earlier king Boudoirs, who ruled parts of Belgium in the Middle Ages. Pretty much everyone does this with the names of the popes as well. When a new pope is elected, their official pope name is formally proclaimed in Latin,
qui sibi nomen imposuit Franciscum.
But most countries just proceed to translate that name into their closest local language equivalent, a practice the church itself seems to encourage. So Pope John Paul's official Latin name was Ioannis Paulus, for instance.
Johannes Paulus.
But in France, he is known as Pope Jean-Paul, while in Italy, he is Pope Giovanni Paolo. Now, obviously, a lot of these names come from the Bible, which did a lot to establish the early Western cultural norm that proper names could and should be translated into different languages. This is because a lot of biblical names themselves are just phonetic translations of Greek translations of Hebrew names. So, for example, our English name David comes from the Greek name David, which comes from the Hebrew name David. To this day, international Bibles remain an interesting guide to how the Western world's most common first names are supposed to be translated.
So, James is rendered as Santiago. I think that's just with that individual, well, not with other people named James in general. So we have English, 3 Romance languages, and Dutch. As you can see, the Romance languages tend to use the letter C and do not like K, while the Germanic languages are kind of the reverse. And French clips these words down to just their stem like English did. Whereas you can still see remnants of the old Latin the old Latin morphological endings in Spanish and Italian. Keep going.
Into other languages. And talking of countries, the names of countries themselves would be the other big example of proper names being widely and unapologetically translated even today. Germany is probably the most famous example, since that country might have the name that has been translated in the most wildly varying ways around the world. This guy even made a little map showing no fewer than 8 different international schools of thought regarding what Germany's name should be.
Sorry, I wanted to see the
has
map
been translated in the most wildly varying ways around the world. This guy even made a little map showing no fewer than 8.
So it looks like the US, Canada, and Belize use a certain way, come from the Latin Germania, as do Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Russia, Italy, Ireland, the Anglosphere, India, Pakistan. This country down here, I think it's Turkmenistan, Thailand, Myanmar, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Djibouti, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and Ghana, Nigeria, Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, South Sudan, and I think Sierra Leone and Liberia, and the Gambia, though some of those might be English speakers. And the name derives from the Old High German Deutsch, which means people. You can see this is the case in Suriname, which speaks Dutch, but also in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany itself, Austria, and Switzerland, the Scandinavian countries, and Iceland, like the Western South Africa, and this northern part. The rest uses Germania, as does Lesotho and Swaziland. China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam also use it. Most of most of Latin America uses bleep, as does Quebec, France, Spain, Portugal, most of the Middle East except it looks like Lebanon and Israel, but it's too small to see. Iran and I think it's Uzbekistan also use bleep, as does a lot of Africa and Laos and Cambodia. Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, you seem to use some weird one that I don't get, and I should unpause now.
Different international schools of thought regarding what Germany's name should be, from Alemania in Spanish to Tyskland in Swedish to, of course, Deutschland in Germany itself. But overall, the idea of translating names has largely fallen into fashion these days, mostly because it comes off as very chauvinistic and arrogant. It exudes a vibe like, oh, my apologies, but I cannot be bothered to figure out how to pronounce a name that is even slightly outside of my comfort zone. I shall instead just assign you a name that is easier for me. Many people whose families immigrated to North America from Eastern Europe or parts of Western Europe, to say nothing of the rest of the world, will often be able to tell you fairly upsetting stories about immigration officials indifferently anglicizing their family names into something that would supposedly be easier for English speakers. The father of noted Jeopardy host Alex Trebek, for instance, was a Ukrainian immigrant named George Terebychuk, but his name was changed to Trebek when he moved to Canada in the 1930s. For a lot of immigrants, this sort of thing was a bit of a quiet humiliation, losing part of your heritage and identity simply for the benefit of people who regarded anything foreign is a hassle to be avoided. The same was true for a lot of place names in the great European empires. When India was under British rule, for instance, the Brits anglicized a number of ancient city names into versions that were easy for them to say. So Mumbai became Bombay, and Kolkata became Calcutta, and so on. In the 2000s, the Indian government became more explicit about wanting the more traditional Indian pronunciations to be the global norm rather than the English bastardizations. And today, a lot of Western atlases and newspapers have accordingly heeded the call. I should note here that what I'm describing is something.
Though apparently there are some Indians on Quora who use the anglicized versions, and also people who speak Indian English, there's audio of them using anglicized versions. For example, you can hear people say a Bangalore on the audio samples of the Indian English Wikipedia article.
Similar but distinct from the phenomenon of places rejecting explicitly colonial names, like when South Africa recently changed the name of the city of Port Elizabeth to Berge. Going from Bombay to Mumbai, in contrast, is more about getting foreigners to perfect their understanding of a name that they currently have close but wrong. You see
these are different phenomena.
Happen with some personal names as well. When I was a kid, we were all taught in school that the name of the late dictator of China was Mao Zedong, which was a spelling and a pronunciation based on a British system of phonetically translating Chinese names. This was the same system that taught us that the name of the Chinese capital city was Peking. But today, the Chinese have...
Yeah, don't worry, I never used that.
Their own phonetic system, and so we are supposed to say Beijing and
Beijing,
Mao Zedong.
Mao Zedong. I don't know if I got the tones right. I've never particularly I have never learned this word in particular.
Not all places seem to have gotten the memo, however. I know that the French still call it Peking, for instance.
And this is why French is...
But the bigger problem...
the international meme where people kind of like make fun of French. Oh wait, that's because of how nonsensical spelling can be at times.
Is that even when Westerners write a more phonetically accurate version of a foreign name, we are still not writing it completely authentically, since we are still limited by the constraints of our beloved Roman alphabet. Now, the obvious defense would be that we in the West need to use the Roman alphabet to translate names from exotic foreign languages like Amharic or Khmer, because that's the only way that our writers can clearly communicate to their readers how to pronounce them. However, this isn't necessarily true when you really think about it. Even within the West itself, the Roman alphabet is often quite decidedly unhelpful for clearly communicating names. And this is because so many different European countries all use different pronunciation systems for the various letters and combinations thereof. For example, if you were reading your English newspaper in the 1980s, you might come across a reference to this guy, who was the dictator of Poland. You pronounce his name like Wojciech Jaruzelski, but obviously just seeing his name in print doesn't communicate any of that. By the standards of English pronunciation, you'd think it should be something more like Wojciech Jaruzelski. Simply seeing the word in Roman letters doesn't communicate anything of use to the reader without first knowing how pronunciation works in the country that that person comes from. For a lot of names that are written in the Roman alphabet, we are thus playing a funny sort of game in which we treat them.
Yeah, these, I think, a lot of ones from like Catholic Eastern Europe, and Slavic nations are traditionally viewed as more difficult, whereas Romanized versions of names that aren't natively Roman are more easier to read in some cases.
As if they were ordinary words, even though in practice they are functioning more like abstract symbols that just coincidentally happen to take the form of our letters. In many ways, this actually makes many European names harder to pronounce than Chinese ones, since at least Chinese names still get the phonetic treatment, something that would seem incredibly condescending to do to another language that uses the Roman alphabet. The Mohawk woman's name I mentioned earlier is perhaps one of the more extreme manifestations of the limits of using the Roman alphabet, since the Mohawk language embraces a novel use of Roman punctuation symbols that have no pronunciation at all in English, which can make them quite intimidating to see in print. But in theory, seeing a name like Gunnasiodir isn't that much different than seeing one like Wojciech Jaruzelski, since an English speaker has no intuitive way of knowing how to read either of them. At best, you just recognize the collection of symbols as a foreign name and have to look up and memorize how it's pronounced. In a way, a foreign name can almost be like a pictogram.
Oh, was that Vietnamese earlier?
Something you never really learn to read in a phonic sense, but just identify. This principle gets even stickier when we apply it to languages that don't use the Roman alphabet. Let's go back to the
Yeah, let's try, for example, Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Name Beijing.
Beijing.
This word might represent an effort to write the city's name in a more accurate phonetic way, but if we would never subject a European name to the indignity of a dumbed-down phonetic translation in the Roman alphabet.
Don't we do that with, like, Ukraine and Serbia and Greece? And yeah.
Why should we do it to the Chinese? In China, the Chinese write Beijing like this and pronounce it in a unique tonal way that our clumsy Roman characters can't fully capture, sort of.
If you use Chinese pinyin, you can indicate the tones orthographically as well.
Like Beijing. Now,
Beijing.
In today's fast-paced computerized wonder world, it wasn't very difficult for me to fetch these Chinese characters for you. I just had to Google Beijing in Chinese and copy-paste what flowed forth. This isn't that much different than what I would have to do if, say, I wanted to get you the name of that kid who won the Tour de France the other day. So, as a matter of principle, is there any real reason why we don't just write more foreign names in their preferred alphabet these days? Check this out. Imagine if the New York Times published a story about Russia that looked like this. From the frozen streets of Russia's Far East and to the grand plazas of
Sibir,
tens of
Moskva.
thousands of Russians rallied in support of the jailed opposition leader on
Alexei,
Saturday in the biggest nationwide showdown in years between Russian authorities and critics of
Vladimir
obviously comes
Putin.
off as kind of weird and intimidating, right? It imposes a high burden on the reader to recognize and understand all of these Russian names
Good
of the
point.
Russian alphabet. But on the other hand, a perfectly normal story about Eastern Europe in the Times might look like this. Czech Foreign Minister extended a message of thanks on behalf of Prime Minister to Hungarian ambassador for his government's generous donation of COVID-19 vaccines. Regional Affairs Minister said the hard-hit regions of
České Budějovice.
will be among the first to receive the doses. Basically,
These
just
Slavic
as intimidating, right? The
languages
only real
are making
difference
it
is that the
complicated.
use of the Roman alphabet creates a thin veneer of familiarity or even false hope of comprehension to all of these foreign names,
I think that's a
even
fair
when they are
point.
hardly any more intuitively readable than ones written in Russian Cyrillic. Either way, you're just throwing a bunch of mostly unreadable names at a foreign audience. The only difference is that in the real world, the Czechs get their names written in their preferred alphabet, while the Russians don't. If we believe that one of the highest forms of cultural accommodation entails writing names in their preferred alphabet, then languages like Russian, Hindi, Arabic, and Thai will always be forced to endure an indignity. Languages like Czech, Vietnamese, Norwegian, or Mohawk will not. In the jargon of today, we could call this alphabet privilege.
How many
The idea
privileges
that the
are
right
there
to get your name
anymore?
or the name of the place where you're from printed authentically in the West is tied entirely to the random variable of whether your language uses the Roman alphabet or not.
Reverse
But alphabet
alphabet.
privilege can work in the other direction too. For
Yeah.
example, if you were to pick up a Chinese newspaper, the name of Joe Biden would appear like this, representing the awkward
Joe
phonetic
Biden.
translation Cho Bai Dang.
Not
That's
even
just
close.
as imperfect as writing Xi Jinping like this. It's
Xi
true that in
Jinping.
most cases these days, phonetic translations into other alphabets are usually authorized, in the sense that I can go to the official translated website of Xi Jinping or Joe Biden and see how they prefer their names to be written in different alphabets. But even this can't escape the fact that it is still very fundamentally inexact and inauthentic. When I was living in Japan, my Japanese employer showed me how I had to write out my name in the Japanese phonetic alphabet, J.McCullough. And it was like, okay, fine, whatever, but that's not actually my name. And no matter how many times I see these little symbols printed on my water bill or whatever, I will never fully acknowledge it as such. Given there is no longer any strong technological justification for doing any of this, and even the communicative justifications are often quite shaky, I do sometimes wonder if this sort of alphabet privilege is just a kind of artifact of another time that's destined to eventually break down. Here in British Columbia,
sure.
there was a story recently about an Aboriginal woman who wanted her driver's license to have her traditional Indigenous name in her nation's traditional language, which looks like this. But the DMV had to
This
turn her
is
down
hard.
because apparently their system couldn't handle some of these special accent marks, which are rare even by European standards. The government says they're moving to correct this, which is fair enough because that's obviously well within the realm of today's technology. But
Yeah, that's
while we're at
possible.
it, is there any reason
Easily
why a
that
Chinese
should be
person
easy.
couldn't also get their name written on their driver's license in Chinese script, or a Russian with his name in Cyrillic and so on? Obviously, most authority figures wouldn't be able to read words in those alphabets, but again, that could also just as easily be said for some complicated Polish name that did use the quote-unquote correct alphabet. So, what is the point of this video? Well, I am always very interested in the concept of universal principles, the idea that it is possible for humans to come up with a set of protocols or procedures that are ethically and intellectually coherent enough to be followed by basically any civilization or culture because they appeal to some inherently agreeable human desire, like, say, freedom or fairness. The UN Fundamental Declaration of Human Rights would be a classic example of this sort of thinking and practice. The alternative to universal principles, by contrast, are what they often describe as arbitrary ones. These are ideas or theories that don't have any pretense of being broadly applicable or transferable, but simply exist because some authority figure has deemed them good enough. A stern parent whose only justification for a decision is because I said so would be a quintessential example. I think that in the democratic West, we tend to regard arbitrary rulemaking as the absolute worst sort of public policy.
does
Instead, we
this
are
have
always
to do with the
striving to
alphabetic
dream
and
up some sort of
and
perfect universal standard
transliterating
of
names?
this or that, rules that everyone can agree to go along with because they're so grounded in unimpeachable logic and principle. And since, for the most part, I think we do a relatively good job of fashioning our civilization around this philosophy, I think it is always interesting to observe the degree that issues exist in our society that remain too difficult to develop a universal standard around, issues that force us into an awkward embrace of arbitrary policies. There's always something humbling about these types of situations because they reveal the elusive nature of perfection, even in a confident culture. Accurate and respectful communication in a world of diverse languages has always been one of our great open-ended challenges as far as this sort of thing goes. With the treatment of names, which are obviously among the most intimate manifestations of language, a particularly vivid sub-challenge. And hopefully I've given a couple of good examples of how Western culture has been shifting in the direction of a more genuinely inclusive and principled set of best practices for dealing with names from different languages, but also how difficult and in some ways impossible this project will always be. So let me know in the comments if you have any particularly interesting examples of the challenges of dealing with names from one language to the next, and I will see you next week. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed...
So that's all for this video. I'll leave the link to the original video in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe to me and to J.McCullough as well. He's almost at 1 million, and I'll end it here.